Finland has just done something no one expected of the world's happiest country. In the space of a single year, it extended the wait for citizenship, halved its refugee quota, sealed its long border with Russia, and passed a law to push asylum seekers back at the frontier. The nation that topped every ranking for trust and tolerance now runs the most right-wing government it has ever had, built on a promise its own ministers call a paradigm shift. So why has Finland, of all places, turned so sharply against migration from the Muslim-majority countries its arrivals once came from? To understand how the world's happiest country arrived here, you have to know how unusually sheltered it once was. For most of its modern history, Finland stood apart from the migrations that reshaped the rest of Europe. It was small, remote, and cold, a nation of 5.5 million wedged between the Baltic Sea and a 1,000-mile frontier with Russia, and it built one of the most equal, high-trust societies on Earth, largely without immigration. Where Sweden, next door, welcomed the world, Finland stayed homogeneous. Its people bound together by a hard language few outsiders ever learned, and a national character they call sisu, a stubborn, quiet endurance in the face of hardship. Foreigners were a rounding error. As late as the 1980s, a Finn could live an entire life and scarcely meet one. The irony was hard to miss. Year after year, international surveys crowned Finland the happiest country on earth, praising its trust, its equality, its schools, and its almost eerie lack of the anger that gripped its neighbors. This was the nation of free education and clean government, of citizens who left their doors unlocked and their children to walk to school alone. That such a place would become one of the most restrictive in Europe on migration seemed, to outsiders, a contradiction. But the two things were connected. Finns often explained their happiness as a product of cohesion and trust, of a society where almost everyone shared the same language, the same institutions, the same unspoken rules. And a growing number of them came to believe that rapid immigration was precisely the thing that could put all of it at risk. That began to change in a single season. In the early 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed next door and civil war tore apart Somalia, a few thousand Somalis arrived and asked for asylum, the first large group of visibly different Muslim newcomers the country had ever seen. Finns still call it the Somali shock. It was modest by European standards, but for a nation with almost no experience of immigration, it was a genuine jolt, and it planted an anxiety that never entirely went away.
Over the following decades, the foreign-born share slowly climbed. Communities of Somalis, Iraqis, and Kosovars took root in the suburbs of Helsinki, and Islam, once effectively absent, became the quiet faith of a growing minority. Today, around 120,000 Muslims live in Finland, still only about 2% of the population, but a presence unimaginable a single generation ago. Then came the year that changed everything. In 2015, as more than 1 million people moved across Europe, the wave that had seemed to belong to the Mediterranean suddenly reached the Arctic. 32,000 people applied for asylum in Finland that year, more than 7 times the usual number, and the overwhelming majority came from a single place. Nearly 2/3 were Iraqis, most of them young men from the region around Baghdad who had travelled the length of Europe and crossed into the north from Sweden. In the border town of Tornio, the state improvised a registration centre almost overnight to process the thousands stepping off the trains. For a country of Finland's size and inexperience, it was the largest and fastest demographic jolt in its modern history. and it landed on a society with almost no machinery and very little cultural memory for absorbing it. The welcome, where it existed at all, was brief. Reception centres filled and multiplied across the country. The cost climbed into the hundreds of millions, and within months the mood soured, exactly as it had across the continent. Reports of tension and of trouble around asylum centres fed a backlash. A handful of centres were set alight. Anti-immigration marches appeared in towns that had never seen such a thing. Crucially, many of the claims did not succeed.
Finland judged that large numbers of the Iraqi arrivals did not qualify for protection and set about rejecting and returning them. Thousands eventually went back, some voluntarily, some by force, and some simply melting into the undocumented shadows of Europe. The lesson the political class drew was not that the system had worked, but that it had very nearly buckled, and that a small country could lose control of its own borders in the space of one autumn. The backlash took a distinctly Finnish form as well. In the northern town of Kemi, a group calling itself the Soldiers of Odin pulled on black jackets and began patrolling the streets at night, presenting themselves as protectors of ordinary Finns against the newcomers, and the image travelled around the world as a symbol of a placid country suddenly on edge. It was a small movement, quickly mocked by clown-costumed counter-patrols and disowned by the mainstream, but it captured a real shift in the national mood. The question that had never truly been asked before, what does it mean to be Finnish and who gets to be, was suddenly everywhere, in the newspapers, in Parliament, and at kitchen tables in towns that had barely seen an immigrant a decade earlier. No party rode that anxiety further than the Finns. Once a fringe movement of rural protest, the Finns party had already broken through earlier in the decade with a blunt message about immigration, sovereignty, and the distant elites of Brussels. 2015 supercharged it. Under a new generation of harder-edged leaders, the party sharpened its language, moved from Euroscepticism toward a central focus on immigration and Islam, and made the argument that Finland's success, its safety, its trust, its generous welfare state, depended on remaining the kind of country it had always been. For years, the mainstream parties held them at arm's length, but the ground was shifting beneath everyone's feet, and the events of the coming decade would carry the Finns from the fringe to the very center of national power. To understand what happened next, you have to add the one factor that makes Finland unlike anywhere else in Europe: Russia. Finland shares a frontier with its giant eastern neighbor, more than 1,300 kilometers long, a border burned into the national memory by a brutal winter war and by decades of wary coexistence through the Cold War. For generations, Finland answered that long shadow with armed neutrality, staying out of alliances so as not to provoke Moscow. Then, in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and Finland's entire calculation changed overnight. In the spring of 2023, the country abandoned 2 centuries of non-alignment and joined NATO. Moscow warned darkly of consequences. They arrived, as they so often do in this part of the world, not as armies, but as people. In the autumn of 2023, something strange began at the eastern checkpoints. In September, 13 people arrived from Russia to claim asylum. In October, 32. In the first 2 weeks of November, 500. They were not Russians. They were men from Syria, Somalia, Yemen, and Iraq, many of whom had been living in or passing through Russia, now appearing at the Arctic border on bicycles, because a rule forbidding anyone to walk across meant Russian guards handed or sold them bikes to cover the final stretch. Finland's government drew a hard conclusion. This was no accident of the season. It was, in Helsinki's chosen word, instrumentalized migration. Human beings used as a lever, orchestrated by the Russian state in retaliation for Finland's turn to NATO. All told, around 1,300 people crossed the eastern border in this way over a handful of winter months. Finland's response was swift and, for such a country, extraordinary. One by one, it shut the crossing points, and then, at the end of November 2023, it did what it had never done in its modern history. It closed the entire land border with Russia, the frontier that had stayed open through the Cold War, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through every chill in between, went dark. Families were divided, ordinary traffic halted, a whole eastern economy of trade and tourism simply froze. And still, Helsinki kept it shut, month after month, arguing that the instant it reopened, Moscow would only resume turning the tap. A country that had prided itself on openness had bolted its own back door and told the world it had been left no other choice. Finland was not acting entirely alone, and it knew it. 2 years earlier, Belarus had funneled thousands of migrants toward Poland and the Baltic states in a near-identical maneuver, and Europe's eastern flank had drawn a lesson from it, that the continent's asylum rules, written for a gentler age, could be turned into a weapon by any hostile state willing to move people around like pieces on a board.
Helsinki now pressed Brussels to recognize instrumentalized migration as a distinct threat and to give frontline countries the legal room to respond. What had once been the position of the nationalist fringe, that the right to claim asylum could not be absolute, was becoming, under pressure from the East, something close to the European mainstream. Finland, the reluctant hardliner, found itself at the very front of that argument. The cost fell hardest on Finland's own eastern edge. In border cities like Lappeenranta and Imatra, whole industries had grown up around Russian shoppers and tourists. And when the frontier closed, that trade vanished overnight. Cross-border families could no longer visit one another. Businesses shuttered. A region that had spent 30 years learning to live beside its neighbour found itself sealed off from it. Yet even there, surveys showed broad support for keeping the border shut.
Finns had decided that the security of the whole outweighed the hardship of the part, and month after month, then year after year, the crossings stayed closed, a line of silent checkpoints stretching away through the forests and the snow. But closing the border raised a far harder question. Under European and international law, a person who reaches your territory and asks for asylum has the right to have that claim heard. You cannot simply push them back. Finland's leaders decided that faced with a neighbour weaponizing migration, the old rules no longer fit. In the summer of 2024, after a bruising debate, Parliament passed what became known as the Deportation Law, formally an act on temporary measures against instrumentalized migration. It allowed border guards, in defined circumstances, to refuse asylum applications at the frontier and turn people back, while exempting children, the disabled, and the especially vulnerable. It sat so awkwardly with Finland's own constitution and treaty commitments that it could only be passed as an emergency exception, clearing the required 5/6 supermajority by a vote of 167 to 31. Legal scholars and human rights bodies warned that Finland, long a champion of the rules-based order, had just written pushbacks into its own statute book. The border was only the most dramatic front. Inland, a quieter revolution was already underway. In June of 2023, the Conservative leader Petteri Orpo had formed what commentators called the most right-wing government in Finnish history, taking the Finns party into office as his central partner. Its leader, Riikka Purra, became finance minister, and the coalition's program promised what she herself hailed as a paradigm shift on immigration.
The early weeks were rocked by scandal, as old anonymous writings resurfaced, and one minister resigned within days over past references to the far right, a reminder of how raw the whole subject remained. But the government held together, and it governed exactly on its word. The measures came in a steady stream, each one narrowing a path that had once been open. The residence requirement for citizenship was stretched from 5 years to 8. The wait for permanent residence rose from 4 years to 6, now tied to language skills and a record of steady work. The annual quota of refugees Finland accepts through the United Nations was cut in half, from 1,050 down to 500. Family reunification was made harder. Hedged with income requirements, a low-paid newcomer could rarely hope to meet. Foreign workers who lost their jobs were given only a matter of months to find another or leave. Benefits were trimmed.
None of these on its own was dramatic. Together, they amounted to a deliberate redrawing of the terms on which an outsider, and given who Finland's outsiders mostly are, a Muslim outsider, could enter, stay, and belong. Alongside the new limits came a harder emphasis on making people leave. The government pledged to speed up the removal of those refused asylum, to expand voluntary return schemes, and to tie the right to stay ever more tightly to work and self-sufficiency. Ministers pointed to stubborn gaps in employment among some immigrant groups and to the strain on a welfare state built for a smaller, more uniform population as proof that the old model had failed. Critics answered that a decade of underinvestment in integration, not the newcomers themselves, had produced those gaps, and that punishing the result would only deepen it.
Both sides were arguing, in the end, about the same thing, whether Finland's famous social contract could stretch to include people who did not look, pray, or speak like the Finns who first wrote it. Tellingly, Finland's turn looked different from the crackdowns further south. There were no bans on headscarves, no laws to shut down mosques, no state maps of Muslim organizations of the kind seen in Austria or France. Finland's Muslim community was too small and too recently arrived to become the explicit target of legislation. Instead, the pressure came through the border and through the paperwork, through who could enter, who could stay, and who could ever call themselves a citizen.
It was a quieter kind of hardening, bureaucratic rather than theatrical, but its message to Muslim newcomers was no less clear. The door that had opened, however cautiously, in the 90s and again in 2015, was now being drawn firmly shut. What made Finland's turn distinct was how completely it fused two anxieties that elsewhere tend to stay separate: identity and security. In most of Europe, the argument over Muslim immigration is about integration, values, and the fabric of society. In Finland, all of that is real, but it sits on top of something older and colder: the physical presence of Russia at the end of the road, and a hard-won independence that Finns have never once taken for granted. When Moscow chose migrants as its instrument, it welded the two fears into a single one. To be tough on the border was to be tough on Russia. To be tough on Russia was to be tough on the arrivals it was sending.
For a nation whose entire modern story is about guarding a frontier, That fusion was politically almost unanswerable. And yet, the clampdown runs straight into a contradiction Finland cannot escape. This is one of the fastest aging societies in Europe, its birth rate among the lowest in the world, its workforce shrinking year after year. Economists and employers say plainly that Finland needs more immigrants, not fewer. The nurses, engineers and care workers who will pay the taxes and staff the hospitals of a greying nation. The very government that slams the door on asylum seekers spends its other hours trying to lure skilled workers from abroad, and discovers that a country busy advertising how unwelcoming it has become is not an easy place to recruit to.
Finland wants the worker, but not the refugee, the labour, but not the asylum claim. And the line between those two things is far blurrier than the policy pretends. There is, as always, a human cost. The government mentions less. The Muslims already in Finland, the Somali families who arrived in the 90s, whose children are now Finnish nurses and engineers, the Iraqis and Kosovars woven into the suburbs of Helsinki. Watch a politics that increasingly treats their faith as a problem to be managed and their presence as a question still to be answered. Every debate about the border, every tightened rule, every headline about instrumentalized migration also lands on citizens who were born in Finland, speak flawless Finnish, and ask for nothing more than to belong.
A policy built to defend a cohesive society risks teaching a generation of young Finnish Muslims that, whatever their passport says, they will always be seen first as newcomers admitted on sufferance. So why has Finland tightened migration from Muslim-majority countries? Because a small, careful nation, long sheltered at the quiet edge of Europe, looked at one turbulent decade, the wave of 2015, the procession pushed across its border by Moscow, the rise of a party that spoke to its oldest fears, and concluded that its safety and its identity were being tested at the very same moment, from within and from without. Whether that is prudence or fear may depend on where you stand and on what the country chooses to do next.
But Finland's dilemma is now Europe's, written in miniature. The border it is defending is not only the frozen line it shares with Russia, it is the harder, invisible border that runs through every modern nation, between the country it has always been and the country it is quietly becoming. And no fence along the eastern frontier can ever tell it where that line truly belongs.